Consider the opinions expressed on the media today, especially in the public media like the ABC and the SBS, and in letters to the editor on political and especially on social matters, and what you'll hear even in the tea room at work. Think of the views expressed by panels on the ABC's Q&A program, usually stacked 3 or 4 to 1 in favour of so-called progressives. Now think back to what our values were 40 years ago. What's happened? There have been big changes in attitudes toward traditional family values. So we now live with fault-free divorce, prenup marriage contracts, much more tolerance about sexuality, and even aggressive pushing of alternative lifestyles as normal and desirable, and will sue you if you disagree. There's a remarkable onslaught on Christianity. This is not so much on religion in general, but on Christianity in particular. It's fashionable to criticize Christianity and even to lampoon its sacred symbols in so-called art. And of course, nobody can be offended by that, can they? But if you criticize Islam, you get branded a racist and a bigot, and you have all the offense police down on you. Militant secular humanists are trying to rebadge our constitutional freedom of religion now as freedom from religion. This was never the intent of our founding fathers, who wrote into the preamble of our Constitution more than a century ago, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God. Current attempts to force on us freedom from religion is actually a form of fascism, because the people pushing it are trying to take away other people's freedoms. There's also a huge wave of cultural pessimism, doubts about who we are and the value of Western civilization. Western civilization, which has given us more economic and financial and freedom advantages than any previous civilization in human history. History contributes to the shaping of national identity, cultures and memories. By revising history, you can craft and recraft that ideological identity. Now, totalitarian systems like Nazism and communism understood that very well. And you see this now being perpetrated upon us with the black armband view of our history being peddled by our left-wing media and in our schools. Political Islam is also corrupting school textbooks by presenting outrageously slanted perspectives as facts and airbrushing any inconveniently conflicting information. There's also now a widespread preparedness to blame the West for all the ills of the world and to compromise on our own cultural values and observances. Things like Christmas, where it's supposedly now politically incorrect to talk about Christmas. You've got to talk about happy holidays, and the only celebrations for Christmas that are okay are if you have Santa Claus and reindeers, but you mustn't actually mention the religious basis of it in case it offends somebody else. And in the picture here, you see an example of a young woman in blue who's completely lost. She actually has the stupidity to regard the Australian flag, under which people fought and died and built and founded a nation, as a symbol of racism. Multiculturalism has been a failure and a disaster. Political leaders in Europe are saying that, and they're saying it very clearly. It's time we said that more stridently in Australia. For many progressives, multiculturalism boils down to the idea that you can praise any culture in the world except Western culture, and you can't blame any culture in the world except Western culture. Now, we need a reality check here. Have people no understanding at all of 1400 years of the history of Islam? This has been a story of violence, oppression of minorities, Arab racism, and also slavery, which is continuing to this day in many parts of the Islamic world. Islam has also waged a remorseless war to destroy every other civilization that it conquers. In the world today, even forgetting that previous 1400 years, look at Burma and southern Thailand and what's happening in the Middle East, where Christian civilization in northern Iraq and places like this is being completely exterminated. When I was at school 50 years ago, at school assembly we had to recite the words, "I honour my God, I serve my Queen, I salute the flag." How much has changed? Why has it changed? How can we've come to despise our own origins and values? Catherine Devaney, a most unfunny Melbourne humorist and a cultural Marxist par excellence, tweeted in 2010, Anzac Day. The men only enlisted to fight for the money, for the adventure, or because they were racist. And she said also, an Australian flag in your front yard tells everyone you're only a couple of Bundy and Cokes away from lynching a Wog, a Slope or an Arab. Unfortunately, there's a crisis in Western intellectual culture. There's a crisis of decadence right throughout our culture. We've never had it so good. People have never been so ungrateful. Everyone who's been through a university since about 1965 has been exposed to and very likely infected by these ideas. Denial of absolute truth. This is your truth, tell me. This is my truth, tell me yours. Denial of absolute standards. Cultural, religious and moral relativism. Nihilism, which is belief in nothing at all. And tolerant non-judgmentalism. Now, in sociology, that's called the values-free perspective. But if you tease that out and ask yourself what that means, it comes down to this. It means having no standards. These intellectual ideas have changed the way that many of us view the world and our place in it. They've also undermined and attacked ideas of patriotism and pride in our nationhood and our own culture. On the ABC's Q&A program on the 1st of October 2012, during the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, an American pseudo-intellectual, Jesse Bering, wowed the audience by saying, free yourself of the illusion of God. Well, that's an argument in itself, that I won't get into now. There's no such thing as good and evil. Well, I wonder whether he'd have a view on that if somebody broke into his house. And there's no such thing as free will. What do you think about that? There's no such thing as free will. That's a cop-out from taking personal responsibility for anything. You can just blame society for all the ills and all the criminal activity that you do. This is actually a form of what I could call social Satanism. There's been a whole lot of culturally poisonous ideas which have infected our society. One of them, a whole plethora of ideas, is in the raising of children. We've raised a generation with far more freedom and far less discipline than was the case of previous generations. And these are some of the things that we've done. We've removed traditions and taboos. We get sucked into the idea that discipline in school is somehow a form of child abuse. We promote self before group and pleasure before duty. We promote sexual license. In fact, the schools are even at very young age now teaching people all sorts of things which legitimise behaviour which previously was absolutely taboo. We downplay heterosexual marriage. We say that it's just one alternative. We reward illegitimacy with welfare payments. We give abortions to teenage girls without parents' knowledge. All this is about promoting me, now. And whatever happened to ideas about sacrifice, thrift, duty, honour, morality, truth, decency, patriotism? These are somehow now all outmoded. What's wrong? Another very culturally poisonous idea is to destroy competitiveness. Now, advanced Western societies got where they got because of the competition for between ideas, competition in the pursuit of excellence. Now, it seems to be a desire to drag everything down to the lowest common denominator, to deride the pursuit of excellence as elitism, push egalitarianism, reward failure, give everybody a certificate for having done something, whether they've passed or whether they've been good or bad, remove honest grading from unit assessments by just saying has met the requirements of the course. Many of the extreme proponents of this destruction of competitiveness want to ignore national interests. They want to deny national cultures and cede national sovereignty to overseas unelected bureaucrats and supranational bodies like the EU, international courts, the World Trade Organization and the UN with its plethora of conventions and committees. The black American intellectual Thomas Sowell said very rightly, much of the social history of the Western world over the past 4 decades has been a history of replacing what worked with what sounded good. So here are some buzzwords that you hear all the time from political correctness: diversity, inclusiveness, multiculturalism, tolerance, mutual respect, non-judgmentalism. And of course, that lovely gaggle of terms of abuse: racism, sexism, homophobia, bigotry, religious bigotry, always only applied to Christianity though, and in our law giving offence or insult or vilification. There's a feigned but only selective moral superiority, and there's a driving force behind all these destructive ideas in our culture and our institutions. The tactic it uses is political correctness, but there's a name for this destructive criticism and undermining of all the institutions of Western civilization and the traditional values that underpin it. It's called cultural Marxism. We'll look at the history and manifestations of this in detail in a separate video. Unfortunately, the openness of our society to the penetration of Islam is hugely facilitated by our political correctness. This engenders denial of reality, squeamishness about words rather than reality, and a refusal to become informed about the nature and agenda of Islam. We need to reject the nonsense from multiculturalism that Australia somehow has no culture of its own, but is just like a piece of blotting paper that absorbs ink from everywhere else. We must be culturist, not multiculturist. We have the right to have culturist economic and immigration policies to protect our own nation and its cultural values. And to discuss cultural diversity is necessary and not racist. Our modern Australian nation is part of Western civilization. Our culture has its roots in Athens, Rome and Jerusalem. We have a very deep cultural history. These are the sources of our rational thinking, our civic duty and law, and moral and ethical values. So-called universal human rights are not universal at all, but Western human rights. They don't exist in Islamic, Chinese or African civilizations, for starters. Multi-ethnicity is not a problem in itself. Australians have many origins, but it's vital that immigrants respect the majority culture, live in harmony with it, and don't seek to subvert and overturn it. One of the bad problems that we have is the capture by cultural Marxists, even if they don't realise fully that they're cultural Marxists, of our education system. It starts now even in the primary schools, goes through the high schools, where kids are being taught what to think, and right through the universities, where many of the departments, particularly in the political and the various types of studies areas, are not really encouraging or developing genuine critical thought, but regurgitated thinking, pre-digested thinking. Here's an example. In Melbourne in May 2014, a primary school instructed its Year 5 and 6 pupils to write a letter to the Prime Minister criticising the government's asylum seeker policies. Now that's a pretty political thing to do. Children were lectured on Article 14 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and then ordered to condemn Australia's stance on refugees, a stance incidentally on which the Prime Minister was elected. They were being told what to think and what to say to the Prime Minister on a complex subject they don't know a lot about. Not a word about the intention behind the policy to protect Australia from a continuing invasion of people, many of whom have values that are completely incompatible with our own. Multiculturalism and the cult of diversity attack our own core culture and our willingness and ability to defend it. You see this in selective or culturally sensitive policing and court judgments. These trash our own democratic value of the rule of law, which is, in fact, one national secular law for everybody. Loud sectional groups make multiculturalism an endless gravy train for government grants. The Labor government of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard gave over $1 million to the Islamic Museum of Australia. Now, there are 70% more Buddhists and Hindus in Australia than there are Muslims. So, where's the Buddhist Museum or the Hindu Museum? Sorry, they didn't shout loud enough. Multiculturalism, in fact, breeds corruption. Chris Bowen, the former Labor Minister for Immigration, gave visas quickly in 2012 to 2 hate preachers from the Hizb ut-Tahrir, an organisation that wants to overturn our law and constitution and replace them with Sharia under the global caliphate. But he delayed one for Geert Wilders a democratically elected Dutch politician who affirms Western values and pluralist democracy, and then he tipped a bucket on him. That is political corruption, political prostitution for votes, and it's a betrayal of the national interest. One of the most disgusting aspects of the so-called progressives is their argument by use of moral selectiveness. Here's one example. A perfect example of lostness is the typical white extreme progressive who denounces the historical European colonisation of foreign lands as imperialistic and oppressive, and yet celebrates the current foreign colonisation of Europe. In effect, the trashing of Western Europe, which is with its much higher culture, by barbarians. The priceless and irreplaceable centres of Western civilization are being destroyed, and yet he celebrates diversity? How can a culture survive when its guts have been torn out? That's what we now face in the West, a struggle for survival of our culture and our values against a remorselessly advancing Islam. The only way that we can have any chance of prevailing in this is if we know what our own values are, affirm them and defend them.